The fourth point, which is another really big one, which is the number of scenes in your screenplay. So the question is do I really need this scene in my screenplay? And this is a really big question for two reasons. Firstly, it keeps your budget lower. And secondly, it makes your screenplay better. So as a writer, screenplays, the best way to tell the story is to use the minimal amount of time, locations, and characters that are required. So we want to get rid of anything that's excess. So if you don't really need that scene in your screenplay, just cut it out. And it's always good writing anyway. You need to get brutal with stuff. There's always going to be things, especially in your early drafts, that are stuff that can just go from that. And draft by draft, that gets easier. And I was just reading, actually it was Daryl, for you guys who know him, I just did screenplay coverage on his feature film, which he just finished the third draft, which is exciting. And it's a really, really good little project. But because it's an earlier draft, some of the notes I had were just like, there's a bunch of scenes you just don't need. Like really, I'm getting what's happening in the story without those scenes. So automatically by pulling a few of those scenes out, the story gets better, gets more concise, and then it gets cheaper automatically. So the key bit is just eliminating the needlessly expensive scenes. So again, it's not about going, we need to get rid of everything so it doesn't cost anything, but it's things that are going, it's needlessly going to cost money. And I'll give a really good example of this. It was on a feature film screenplay. I was doing feedback for someone on last year, and I was actually mentoring them on the project as well. And they were going to self-finance this project. And essentially it was a family story. And the opening scene was set in 1950, seeing this young family. It turns out they end up having 5 children. So we see them in 1950 with their first children. We see them again in the second scene is 1960 with, they've now got 3, 1970, they've now got all of their 5 kids. And when I read that, that was the first 4 pages of the screenplay. So straight away, some people go, oh, a period film is a problem. A scene in 1950 isn't necessarily a problem. A scene in 1820 isn't necessarily expensive. Imagine you've got a film set in 1820 and it's out in the bush and it's 2 characters. Your only cost is the costumes because, trees all still look the same back then as they do now. And you're not in a city where you've got to have vintage cars and you have to digitally remove different types of power lines and you have to get 150 extras all dressed in these costumes. So again, a period film in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. But when I read this, those first 3 scenes were setups for the context of the family. And I'm reading it going, well, if that's in 3 decades, none of those actors can double up except a couple of the adults. So the 1950s scene, you got to get your 3 kids. And then in the 1960s and 70s, each time you've got to replace those child actors. Because by the time we get into the 3rd scene, they've gone from being 5-year-olds to 15-year-olds. And so what it was, I said to him, in your first 4 pages, you have to cast 12 actors. And out of those 12, only 2 of them are going to appear after page 4 for the rest of the film. That's a lot of work to find that cast. And I was asking what it was like, why those scenes were in there. And she was sort of saying, I need to set up the family in this context. And I kind of said, okay, perfect. That's what you need to tell the story. Just pick one of those eras. It doesn't matter whether it's the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Just pick that one era that creates the context of the family to set up the story. And then you only need to be finding your, 4 cast, and 2 of them are going to be pushing on. So you're going to find all of your cast, but they're going to be able to be used later on as well, or you just need them for that time period. And also said, make that scene a longer one as well. So use your 4 or 5 minute opening just in that era, and then straight away, all the elements are stripped back. The screenplay is more concise, and it still works because we understand the context of her family now.